Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 638. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We got a lot of news to get through on today's show, but first, I want to mention that at the Libertarian Institute, we are holding our summer fundraiser. So if you can, head on over to the Libertarian Institute, make a donation, and help us so we could keep producing all the great content that we produce. Of course, for my part at the Institute, I put out this show, I write news articles every day, and I produce the daily news roundup. So there's a ton of content, and that's coming from just myself. We have a pretty good sized staff at the Institute. Scott Horton is currently working on his book, Provoked. Keith Knight, host Don't Tread on Anyone, is working on a couple of ongoing projects. We got Patrick McFarlane and Tommy Solomon's hosting their podcast, and tons of great op-eds in the featured section of the Institute every single day. Head on over, check us out. If you like our work, help us to continue going by making a contribution. And with that, let's get into today's show. All right, the first story we have here. Republican hawks want Mike Pompeo and Tom Cotton in Trump's cabinet. So this is horrific. I think for most people and Americans now are probably operating under the presumption that Trump is going to win the November election and will be the next president of the United States. And so talking about who's going to be in his cabinet, who's going to be surrounding him is incredibly important. I think one of the things that we learned from the first Trump administration is rather than what we had hoped, which is that the policy will originate with and kind of all come from Trump himself, the people he surrounds himself with have a lot of say over what policies actually get put into action. And so you could look at examples like the war in Somalia. That's something that Trump wanted to exit. His advisors told him that that wasn't possible, and so he stayed in. If you look at the situation in North Korea, he was on the brink of a deal with Kim Jong-un to end the war, to, lead to North Korea really curtailing its nuclear program and for the U.S. to really remove its hostile stance against North Korea in Asia. And rather than moving through with that, after he hired John Bolton, he allowed John Bolton to hijack the negotiations and absolutely destroy them. So if Pompeo and Cotton end up in Trump's cabinet, this is a really bad sign, and it would cut against any maybe hope that J.D. Vance had given us that this administration would be a little bit better. Now, of course, even when we're talking about J.D. Vance, what we're really talking about is no change to American Middle East policy, particularly the policy of supporting Israel. Where you really get the change in policy is these are people who at least advocate curtailing the war in Ukraine in some way. The U.S. is going to provide less for the arms and money and everything going to Ukraine. We're going to push the European partners to do that more. And maybe we will be willing to engage in reasonable discussions with Ukraine. And of course, all of that is because they believe the real threat originates in Beijing and not Moscow. And so it's not as if Vance isn't a hawk and isn't a foreign policy interventionist. He is, however, better on at least one war and has maybe a somewhat better, more America first attitude. Although, again, this is all very, very questionable. And let's look at what, Cotton and Pompeo would be like in the administration. So Dave DeCamp writes at antiwar.com, the more hawkish wing of the Republican Party is hoping former President Donald Trump will put ultra-hawks in prominent positions in his cabinet if he is elected for a second term as a counterbalance to Senator J.D. Vance being picked as vice president. Vance being chosen by Trump has alarmed many Republicans due to his opposition to the proxy war in Ukraine. One influential GOP member told Politico, "I'm scared to death." The report said that Republican hawks hope to see Pompeo, Trump's former CIA director and Secretary of State, as the Secretary of Defense. Pompeo is a staunch supporter of the Ukraine proxy war, Israel, and the U.S. military buildup around China. During his time at the CIA, Pompeo sought revenge against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange for the organization's publication of documents detailing the spy agency's hacking tools known as Vault 7. In 2021, a bombshell report from Yahoo News revealed that under the CIA, Pompeo plotted to kidnap Assange and even discussed killing him. Senator Tom Cotton was another ultra-hawk mentioned in the Politico report as a potential counterbalance to Vance. The report said the Republican hawks would like to see him as head of the CIA or inside the White House. Other names being mentioned for high-level positions inside Trump's former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien and Senator Bill Hagerty. Vance became a leading critic of Ukraine when he entered the Senate about a year and a half ago. In an interview with the New York Times, he outlined a potential way to end the war, although he left open the possibility of some limited military assistance for Kiev. He said, "What I would like to do, and what I think fundamentally is achievable here with the American leadership, but you will never know till you have the conversation, is you freeze the territorial lines somewhere close to where they are right now. That's number one. Number two is you guarantee both Kiev's independence but also neutrality. The fundamental thing is the Russians have asked from the beginning," Vance explained. He added, "I'm not naive here. I think the Russians have asked for a lot of things, dishonestly, but neutrality is clearly something that they see an existential threat for them. And then three, there's going to have to be some American security assistance over the long term. I think those three things are certainly achievable." While Vance was portrayed as an isolationist and a non-interventionist, he is hawkish on Iran and China and strongly supports Israel's onslaught in Gaza. In an interview on Monday night, Vance came out strongly against Iran, saying, "If you're going to punch the Iranians, you punch them hard." Vance has also framed the need to wind down the proxy war in Ukraine as necessary to focus on a military buildup around China, which he labeled as the biggest threat facing the U.S., putting him in line with the Pentagon. Vance told the Times last month, "The thing that we can control now is making it costly for them to invade Taiwan, and we're not going to do that because we're sending all the damn weapons to Ukraine and not Taiwan." And so, they're worried about him being too soft, but really he is a hawk just like the rest of them, of a little different flavor. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. NATO appoints senior official to represent alliance in Ukraine. On Wednesday, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg announced that the alliance was appointing senior official to represent interests in Ukraine, following up on a commitment made during last week's NATO summit in Washington. Stoltenberg said the role would be filled by Patrick Turner, a British official who, according to the NATO press release, previously served as NATO Assistant Secretary General for Operations and Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning, as well as in a range of senior service positions in the United Kingdom. Turner is expected to take the role in Kiev in September of 2024, Stoltenberg explained. As the senior representative, Mr. Turner will head the NRU NATO representation in Ukraine and act as a focal point for NATO's engagement with Ukrainian authorities in Kiev. The plan to station civil office in Ukraine was one of several pledges NATO made during the summit related to the proxy war. The alliance also vowed to provide $43 billion in military aid in 2025 and is the process of forming a new command center in Germany to oversee the training and arming of Ukrainian forces. The purpose of the command center is to have NATO take over some of the duties currently filled by the U.S. in what some officials have described as a way to Trump-proof Ukraine support. The idea is if a future administration wants to wind down aid to Ukraine, NATO would be able to continue the proxy war, but the effort will still be hugely reliant on U.S. funding. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, July 17th, antiwar.com. Germany plans to slash Ukraine's spending in half. So Germany is planning to cut its spending on military aid for Ukraine in half next year and is telling Kiev to look elsewhere for more funding. According to Germany's draft budget, Berlin will be spending on Ukraine 4 billion euros, which is $4.35 billion a year, and that's down from 8 billion euros. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was initially reluctant to arm Ukraine and initially resisted sending heavy weapons such as tanks, citing the risk of World War III, but he eventually agreed, and Germany became a top supplier of weapons to Ukraine in Europe. The draft budget still needs to be finalized and could face some resistance in Parliament. However, Scholz's government officials appear set on making the cuts to cover other spending. Another issue is that Germany's military has depleted much of its stockpiles by arming Ukraine. According to Politico, German Finance Minister Christian Lindner said that the cabinet meeting that approved the draft budget that Ukraine would have to rely more on funds from other European sources, including a $50 billion that may be provided by using frozen Russian assets. Group of 7 leaders agreed to give Ukraine a loan of $50 billion that would be paid back from profits made off of the frozen Russian central bank assets, but the plan hasn't been finalized. The step will mark a significant escalation of the economic campaign against Moscow. And it also seems very short-sighted. So they're going to take the profits off of the Russian frozen interest, and it's going to take probably a couple decades to pay off that loan using that process. And so if they're talking about using a chunk of that $50 billion now, presumably that wouldn't be around later for Ukraine to give Ukraine. But additionally, the interest off of that money wouldn't be around to give Ukraine. And so it would seem that, they're kind of digging themselves into a hole, which they've done time and time throughout this war. So we shouldn't be surprised. But using a big chunk of this $50 billion would seem to be a pretty short-sighted step by Germany here. Also, this is a really interesting policy that we're seeing happen at a time when I'm presuming that Trump is going to win the November election, and maybe significantly so, and have what feels like a real mandate to govern. The Republicans win the popular vote, maybe take the Senate and the House. So this would be quite substantial. Trump is saying that, look, we're going to curtail our support and have the Europeans step up. And so with maybe the biggest or the second biggest European contributor now scaling down its support significantly, the pool of countries to draw that support from is really narrowing, and that's going to become a big problem. All right, couple of stories dealing with China here. China stops arms control talks with U.S. over arms sales to Taiwan. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry said Wednesday that Beijing has stopped arms control talks with the U.S. over continued U.S. arms sales to Taiwan and other steps that go against China's core interest. The U.S. and China held consultation on arms talks back in November of 2023. A reporter asked the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Yin about comments from U.S. officials suggesting China declined to hold another round. Over the past weeks and months, despite China's firm opposition and repeated protests, the U.S. has continued to sell arms to Taiwan and done things that severely undermine China's core interests and mutual trust between China and the U.S. This has seriously compromised the political atmosphere for continuing arms control consultations. Consequently, the Chinese side has decided to hold off on discussions with the U.S. on a new round of consultations on arms control and non-proliferation. The responsibility lies fully with the U.S., the spokesman said. Lin said China stands ready for arms control talks in line with principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation, but the U.S. must respect China's core interests and create necessary conditions for dialogue and exchange. And this is something that I have been railing about throughout the Biden administration, and this is one of the things when Biden was elected, there was supposed to be this return to international normalcy. And you had hoped that would mean, okay, we're going to engage in diplomacy once again, particularly with Beijing. But that has completely fallen apart. And the White House has never shown any respect whatsoever for Beijing and has created and really worsened the ties between the two countries. So the U.S. has stepped up its military and diplomatic support for Taiwan in recent years, ignoring frequent warnings from Chinese officials, including President Xi Jinping, that that the issue is the first red line in the China-U.S. relationship that must not be crossed. Since November of 2023 arms control talks, the U.S. provided several new rounds of arms sales to Taiwan, including one last month worth $360 million for hundreds of armed drones and related missile equipment. President Biden also signed a $95 billion foreign military aid bill that included $8 billion for military aid for Taiwan and other spending in the Indo-Pacific region to prepare for war with China. The U.S. has always sold weapons to Taiwan since severing diplomatic relations in 1979, but began providing weapons using U.S. taxpayer-funded military aid last year, a step the Chinese military warned would be absolutely intolerable. A little bit more on Taiwan here from Dave DeCamp. Trump says Taiwan should pay for its defense. Now, one of the things that Dave has been pointing out, and the reason I think this article is really important, is this has been misreported and misstated by advocates of Donald Trump who are less interventionist themselves, who maybe recognize that Trump's confrontational policy with China is one of his worst, but just feel that on the margins, Trump is better than Joe Biden. And so a lot of those people are touting this as, see, Trump really is a non-interventionist. He doesn't even want to go to war with China over Taiwan. And that's not really what he said here. So former President Donald Trump, the Republican Party's presidential nominee, told Bloomberg in an interview published on Tuesday that Taiwan should pay for the U.S. to defend the island and compared the idea to an insurance policy. President Biden has vowed several times that he would intervene to defend Taiwan in the event of attack, breaking a decade-long U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity on the issue. Trump was asked if he would defend Taiwan and said, look, a couple of things. Number one, Taiwan, I know the people very well, respect them greatly. They did take about 100% of our chip business. I think Taiwan should pay us for defense. You know, there's no different than an insurance company. Taiwan doesn't give us anything. Taiwan is 9,500 miles away. It's 68 miles from China, a slight advantage in China's massive piece of land. They could just bombard it. They don't even need to. I mean, they can literally just send shells. Now, they don't want to do that because they don't want to lose all those chip plans. So that's what Trump said. During his time in office, President Trump oversaw an increase in U.S. support for Taiwan that ramped up tensions between the U.S. and China. President Biden continued boosting ties with Taiwan, and Trump overall tough on China policy, including tariffs and trade wars. Trump suggested to Bloomberg that tensions shouldn't be so high if he remained in office, saying, the day I left, they sent 28 bombers right over the top, and they've been very aggressive ever since, and they got ships all over the place. Trump appears to be referring to China's military flights in Taiwan's air defense identification zone, which is different from the island's airspace. China first increased its flights in Taiwan's ADIZ when Trump was in office in 2020 in response to the U.S. sending high-level officials to the island. But Chinese flights in the ADIZ and across the median line, the unofficial barrier that separates the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, have dramatically increased under President Biden, especially since then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in 2022. Trump reiterated in the interview that defending Taiwan would be very hard for the U.S., but didn't roll it out. I just think we had to be smart, but remember, 9,500 miles away, he said. So, you know, this isn't a great statement from Donald Trump, but you know, at least it's something somewhat reasonable compared to the current status quo, but only a little bit. And of course, I think another problem we have with Trump too is if he does wind down the proxy war in Ukraine, he may see the military buildup and escalating a conflict with China as the reciprocal to that. And so I think in some ways a conflict with China would be more likely under Trump than Biden, even when we have statements like that, where he acknowledges the challenges of fighting a war with China over Taiwan. All right, next up here, Pentagon officially ends Gaza Pier operations. I wrote this one for the Institute on July 17th. A temporary floating pier that was intended to bring food and other aid into Gaza has been officially terminated, according to the Department of Defense. While the White House is touting the operations as a success, it has cost hundreds of millions of dollars and provided only a trickle of aid to the desperate Palestinians. In March, during his State of the Union address, President Joe Biden announced the creation of a sea route to bring aid into Gaza. The White House hoped the pier would bring hundreds of trucks full of supplies to the besieged enclave daily and relieve mounting political pressure on Biden to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people by ending support for Tel Aviv. Following the State of the Union address, aid agencies warned that the sea route would not bring sufficient aid into Gaza and would distract from the need to open more land crossings into Gaza, which human rights expert says the most efficient way to get food into the territory. In the 4 months since Biden ordered the creation of the pier, it has been only in operation for 20 days. On multiple occasions, the sea route was shuttered by rough seas. Additionally, the World Food Program stopped delivering the meager amount of aid that did reach Gaza over safety concerns. And so, a couple things that I saw pointed out. Apparently, it took longer for the ships to get from the U.S. ports to Cyprus, longer for them to construct the pier than the pier was actually open and functioning. Of course, we did have that one incident the first time the pier broke apart. It was, I think, in 3-foot seas with 15-mile-per-hour winds, which I don't think are particularly rough seas. Look, I don't own a boat, and I'm sure if you're sitting out there in a little boat in those kind of seas, then it would feel pretty rough, but, rough in the sense of this is an uncommon storm. That didn't seem to be the case because the pier was shut down time and time again because there was a storm approaching. So during the period that the pier was in use, Israel seized the Gaza-Egypt border, destroying the Rafah crossing that previously served as Gaza's main lifeline. Following those operations in early May, the number of Palestinians near famine has only grown. During the pier's limited days in operations, 3 soldiers working on the project sustained injuries. One of those injuries was serious. The soldier was in critical condition and is still hospitalized months later. He has been transferred back to the U.S. and is, I think, somewhere in Texas receiving military care. Other troops were put within range of the fighting in Gaza. While the Department of Defense insisted that no U.S. troops would enter the strip, a U.S. military vehicle was photographed in shallow waters on the beach. Despite these failures, the Pentagon is claiming that the pier was a success. This is Central Command Deputy Commander Vice Admiral Brad Cooper on Wednesday. He said, "Our assessment is that the temporary pier has achieved its intended effect to surge a very high volume of aid into Gaza and ensure that aid reaches the civilians in Gaza in a quick manner." Cooper claimed that nearly 20 million pounds of aid reached Gaza through the sea route, although it is unclear what percentage of that assistance actually made it to the Palestinian people because, again, the aid agency that was distributing the aid was coming under attack, and so they couldn't distribute it anymore, and so they were just basically holding it in the area controlled by Israel near the pier, and then they had a private contractor move it to warehouses to prevent it from spoiling. But there's no indication even then that this aid all made it to the Palestinian people. So just a complete failure by Joe Biden. And what a perfect illustration for his presidency. You have this massive pier project that he announces. It's overcomplicated. It's unreasonable. All he has to ask Israel to do is open a single border crossing, a single land border crossing, and allow aid to enter that crossing unhindered. That's all he had to ask Israel to do. But rather than doing that, he creates this whole elaborate pier process, spends $250 million on it. Soldiers get injured, and it accomplishes absolutely nothing as far as helping the Palestinian people. It's all a failed PR stunt, and it's just a perfect representation of our dying president and really dying country. All right, so next up here, death toll for Palestinian journalists hits 160 in Gaza. So the death count for Palestinian journalists in Gaza has hit 160 as Israeli forces continue to target civilians throughout the Strip. The mass killing of reporters has shrouded the true devastation caused by the Israeli bombing campaign. The Gaza media office reported that Palestinian journalist Muhammad Abdullah Mashmash was killed on Tuesday in the 160th reporter killed since October 7th. He was the program director for a local radio station. He was killed along with 4 other people at a UN-run school in the Nusra refugee camp. Al Jazeera's Hani Mohammed reported the Israeli attack on the Al-Razi middle school in the heart of the camp is such a busy area happened during rush hour when the streets around the overcrowded school were full of people. The Al-Razi school was the 6th UN-run school bombed by Israel in the past 10 days. Gazan students have not attended classes since the Israeli onslaught started 9 months ago. Many of the UN-run schools in Gaza have been operating as shelters for the 2 million internally displaced Palestinians. A UN official estimated that 1 million civilians were now crammed into the overcrowded schools across the Strip. Israel has destroyed most of the structures in Gaza, leaving many Palestinians homeless and displaced multiple times. The mass killing of Palestinian journalists has resulted in the de facto media blackout of Gaza. Many of the videos that have surfaced throughout the Israeli military operations have revealed massive war crimes and painted Tel Aviv in a negative light. And so, yes, I do think the targeting of Palestinian journalists is intentional. Additionally, some people might note that I think within the first 3 to 4 months of this conflict, it was pretty early in this year that I was reporting that it had crossed 100 journalists killed, and it seemed that the pace had slowed down. I really think the situation is journalists, there's only 2.3 million people in Gaza, so the number of pre-war journalists probably isn't that high. You know, it's in the hundreds, it's not in the tens of thousands or anything like that. And 160 have already been killed. Others have been wounded and fled, or wounded, or, are in some hospital or something like that. So when you really, there are probably others that are trapped under the rubble, already dead, So I think the reason that the pace of the killing has slowed is, one, just the reporting on the ground. The sites where you could say, hey, this person died, is just decreasing. It's harder to get the bodies to where they need to go because most of the transportation in Gaza right now is happening on donkey carts. And so there's a lot of struggles with reporting the deaths, and also with the number of journalists already killed. There just might not be that many left to take out at this point. And so I do think this has really contributed with the lack of information that we have about the situation in Gaza, because we don't know what's happening inside the Strip. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, July 17th. Mossad chief says Netanyahu's demand may thwart ceasefire deal. So the Mossad director, David Barnea, the Israeli official leading indirect negotiations with Hamas, said Wednesday that one of the Prime Minister Netanyahu's demands may prevent a potential ceasefire. According to Haaretz, he presented the security cabinet with the differences between Netanyahu and the negotiating team. He said the main problem is now that Netanyahu's insistence on creating a mechanism for Israel to monitor Palestinians returning to the north of Gaza during a potential ceasefire deal. Israel has previously agreed to allow the free movement of Palestinians so they could return to the north, but Netanyahu has reversed that concession and publicly called for the agreement to prohibit any armed men from entering the north. The Israeli security and military officials favor a ceasefire deal, but Netanyahu has been working to sabotage an agreement as members of his own coalitioning are threatening to quit, which could threaten his hold on power. Israeli officials have told the media that Netanyahu was looking to make sure a deal didn't happen before he heads to Washington next week to address Congress and meet with President Biden. Also on Wednesday, members of the ultra-Orthodox Shah's party called on Netanyahu to reach a deal with Hamas and ignore members of his government threatening to quit, which include National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. The Shah's party said in a letter to Netanyahu, "We believe that the conditions created now following the appreciated military pressure and targeted killings create the appropriate timing to reach such a deal that preserves Israel's vital national security interests and brings the hostages home. The Shah's party holds 11 seats in the Knesset and is a part of the government coalition. Referring to Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the party told Netanyahu not to fear the voices within the coalition who oppose the deal and encourage you to continue to act responsibly for the sake of the redeeming of the captives. The two Likud ministers, the science and technology minister and transportation minister, are also calling for an agreement. While Netanyahu, the most extremist elements of the government are increasingly on their own in opposition to the deal, the Biden administration continues to provide support for the genocidal campaign in Gaza, despite claiming to want to see a ceasefire. In the meantime, Israel continues to pound the Gaza Strip. Gaza's health ministry said Wednesday that 81 Palestinians were killed by Israeli strikes in the previous 24-hour period. One attack targeted a UN-run school, turned into a shelter for refugees in the Nusra camp. All right, and then last up here today, this one from Brett Wilkins, originally at Common Dreams, reprinted at antiwar.com. I am not a terrorist. Letters from Gaza children decry daily horrors of Israeli assault. So a UK-based humanitarian group on Tuesday delivered heartbreaking letters from two Palestinian girls, including one who just lost her arm in an Israeli attack, imploring new Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer to intervene and help bring about permanent ceasefire in Gaza. So 15-year-old Maas Adel Hadi, one of the girls, wrote, "We write to you with our hearts full of sorrow and our spirits crushed by the daily suffering inflicted upon us by the brutal war. We live in constant fear and anxiety, with shells accompanying us around the clock, reaping lives, sparing only those fortunate enough to survive. Destruction and devastation surround us on all sides. Our question is, why must children pay such a horrendous price?" According to the Gaza Health Ministry, an average of 58 children have been killed each day, which is more than the number of children killed on October 7th, by the way, since Israel launched its retaliatory assault and siege of Gaza after the Hamas-led attacks on October 7th. And that, by the way, only counts 16,000 dead children, that 68 average or 58 average. I think that number is probably significantly higher, into the 20s of thousands. There are also 17,000 children missing in Gaza, with I believe about 4,000 of them estimated to be dead and buried beneath the rubble, but that number could be higher. So the ministries whose figures have been deemed reliable by Israeli intelligence says that the Israeli bombs and bullets have wounded more than 34,000 Palestinian children, and thousands more are missing and presumed dead and buried beneath the rubble of bombed out homes and other buildings. Over 17,000 other Gazan children are orphaned. So the letter said, "We wake up every day to the sounds of bombs and rockets with no safe place to seek refuge. This violent war has taken our homes, schools, families, relatives, friends, and classmates. It has forced us to sleep in poor tents and in the open air, our bodies scorched by the sun during the day and deprived of sleep at night due to constant airstrikes and random shelling. We need your support and urgent intervention to end this tragedy. We demand an immediate ceasefire and the establishment of peace, because we, the children of Palestine, deserve to live in safety and peace. We also urge you to work on rebuilding our schools and hospitals that have been destroyed, and to provide the necessary psychological and educational support so we can regain our lives and futures. Stop the death by starvation and the killing by denying medicine and the destruction of health centers. Bring back life through songs, poems, and music. We are the children who hope for a dignified life and do not wish for anyone to suffer. Save our lives, dreams, and rights. We deserve our childhood. We are not just numbers or news in the media reports. We are living souls carrying hope in our hearts, awaiting your swift and effective action." So there's also 16-year-old Hala Abdul Salim, one of the thousands of child amputees in Gaza, and she asks, "Will my hands grow back, or am I condemned to live without an arm?" I am not a terrorist to be exterminated, she wrote, who her family is also forcibly displaced from their home and it was bombed. She continued, I am not a terrorist for my house to be destroyed and my family to be killed. I am not a terrorist to live in a tent that is scorching during the day and freezing at night, unfit for even animals. It is time for you to bear the consequences of your mistakes from a century ago. End the occupation, stop the genocide. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And for those of you who have contributed to our fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute, I really appreciate it. And hopefully we will continue to have some contributions to flow in, and we could keep doing our mission over at the Institute. Thanks, everyone.